Thank you. Thanks, Todd, for that introduction. Very good point. This is an interesting title because I think he's a very interesting guy. Ambrose Burnside is a fascinating character, and he's been discussed at length. I would say a lot of people have discussed his battles and his successes and failures in the Civil War. That's unfortunately, if that's what you're here for, that's not really what I'm here to talk about. As you can tell from the title, I would like to talk about some of his other exploits, some things he did before he fought in the Civil War, and even his postbellum career as well. But he was very, very well liked, and we'll see that throughout the presentation, despite some of his failings as a military commander. Throughout the briefing or presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to answer them, and afterwards I'll have time for questions as well. Ambrose Burnside, an innovator in firearms and facial hair. So the very famous facial hair here. Here's a nice colorized photo of Ambrose during his time in the Civil War. And he had this pretty much his whole adult life, this exact style of facial hair. He'd never really deviated from when he was first enrolled in West Point even. He had this at a young age of just 22, 23, and he kept it his entire life. And very, very notable Civil War generals were pretty expressive with their facial hair. There's lots of different styles. His was one of the more unique ones, with the chops coming down up and over into the mustache without the chin hair. But that's not all we'll be talking about today. Really, I'll save that till the end. What I'd like to talk a little bit more about is his life in general. So his early life, he was born in 1824 in Liberty, Indiana, to a father who was a county clerk and an associate judge, and a mother, Pamela, born there. And interesting story about his name. So everyone knows him as Ambrose Everett Burnside now. However, that was not his birth name or the name he was baptized under. His name was Ambrose Everett Burnside. The Everetts were family friends who were doctors and a midwife, and they were helping birth Ambrose himself. They had recently lost their first child, and so in honor, both Pamela and Edgell wanted to name him his middle name, Everetts. So he does go for the first 22 years of his life with the middle name Everetts, and that does change later on. His mother does pass away when he's only 16 years old. She had been working to help provide money for his education. They did not want him to. They did not actually want him to join the military. He had a very early interest in that. However, his mother wanted him to get his education and maybe work in politics even. However, she does pass away when he's only 16, and after that, he does not have the money to continue his education, so he has to leave his schooling to go be an apprentice to a tailor about 15 miles away. He does serve as a tailor's apprentice the entire apprenticeship. He becomes very deft with needle and thread, something that will serve him later on in his military career as he needs to fix buttons, rips in his uniform, things like that. He is always able to do that himself. However, he does get bored. He does get bored with his time as a tailor. He's good at it, but it's not something that really engages him mentally, so he does a lot of reading during that time. And a lot of what he's reading is military history. Again, he goes back to that early childhood liking of the military history. He reads up a lot about Jackson, the Indian Wars, and during that time he has an individual who stops into the shop, a local magistrate who stops into the shop to get something tailored. He's the only one in there, and he's sewing and reading at the same time. He's reading a book on military history, and he says, well, if you're so interested in military history, why don't you apply to West Point? And this is where this whole idea kind of stems from. He gets that little idea in his head, and he goes to his father, who has some connections in the government. As I said, an associate judge, county clerk. He was working with the state senate in Indiana at that time, and so he's able to secure an appointment to West Point for Ambrose later on when he's about 22 years old. And this is the town square of Liberty, Indiana at that time, where he grew up. So he does arrive at West Point in 1843, and immediately upon his arrival, that name change happens. So he does try to check in as Ambrose Everett Burnside. I guess the person checking him in either had a typo or they didn't like it, and they went for something that was much more traditional, Everett, and from that point forward, he is known as Ambrose Everett Burnside, but that happens when on his initial check-in to West Point. His roommate for all 4 years he was there, Harry Heth, a very famous Confederate general. They obviously are enemies during the Civil War, but afterwards they are very close friends again. And that does go for a lot of the people that he meets during this time. Like Dave's talk next month, which will be about the Mexican-American War. West Point at this time and the Mexican-American War thereafter were a lot of these jumping off points for a lot of these famous names that you'll see throughout the next 20 years in history. I thought it was pretty funny reading through one of his biographies. He earned quite a few demerits in his first couple of years. Played pranks, shaving people's heads, getting caught as the cadet barber, it was called. So he was known always as a very likable fellow, very amiable, very good with his peers and his subordinates. But he did have a side, a wild side. Some of them said, some of his superiors said, especially in his downtime. He does graduate in the class of 1847, which started 50, only commissioned 30 at the end. And around that time, either a couple of years before him or a couple of years after him, some very, very famous names in the academy at that time. McClellan, Hancock, Park, Pleasanton, Stonewall Jackson, Pickett, Hill, Stewart. Very, very famous people. A lot of them he's very close friends with, and even develops these friendships later on during the Mexican-American War and then after the Civil War as well. This is a picture of West Point in the mid-1860s at that time, so a few years after he does graduate. So his early military career, immediately after graduating West Point, he does get sent to the Mexican-American War. Unfortunately for him and a lot of those younger lieutenants who their whole senior year had been hearing about these battles that were happening, they were raring to go, ready to jump into battle, and by the time they get there, the majority of the hostilities are over. So they do primarily conduct garrison duties. They do land in Veracruz initially and then move in towards Mexico City. That's where he spends a lot of time learning from superiors, these battlefield tested commanders, people that had actually experienced these things that he'd been learning about for the last 4 years. Even at that time, there was already complaints about how difficult it was to fire weapons and fire them accurately. There was an old Army saying that you would probably fire your weight in lead in order to hit someone, and even then you would be lucky to hit them. The rifles were just that inaccurate at that time. And the Revolutionary War, which was still 50, 60 years prior, there really wasn't very many advancements at that time. The weapons were significantly lighter and smaller in some cases, but they were not necessarily more accurate, the rifling not having been developed yet. So he does hear a lot about that at that time, and this is a pretty funny one here. He does almost quit the military due to a gambling problem. So there was a lot of gambling institutions in Mexico City, and he's sitting around and he's not really doing anything during this garrison duty. So he has a lot of free time and a lot of time with other younger early 20s-year-old men, and they do spend a lot of time gambling. Him specifically, he wasn't very lucky. He does go on to lose all of his wages at the time and 6 months advance wages. Yeah, not too good on his part. And he thinks about resigning, quitting the military because there's no way he could possibly move forward with that. He does receive a short-term loan from a superior officer who really thinks that he shows some promise. He doesn't want him to quit the military. He says, here, get your act together, stop gambling. Here's an advance loan, pay off your debts, and move forward with this. This will not be the first time that he tries to quit the military or resign his commission. You'll see that throughout his career. Very, very early photo. Like I said, still pretty young, balding already, but very, very young, a little bit more trim, but still with that facial hair. This is just a couple of years after his graduation at West Point. And then directly from the Mexican-American War, he receives orders to Fort Adams, Rhode Island. This is his first duty station here in the United States. Fort Adams, Rhode Island is right on a peninsula, very, very old, and it's still a site that you can visit today. Being his first trip to Rhode Island, he does make a lot of friends, a lot of political connections, a lot of social connections as well. The military there, the garrison there was just very heavily involved in social life. They would throw balls, galas, these parades, things like that, and it was a big meet and greet for the civilians and the military members to intermix. And he does fall in love with the area and the people. Very, very, very different from the Midwest Indiana life that he grew up in. Here are these people that are very cultured, very well read. This high society that he finds himself very, very attracted to. This is early 1900s Fort Adams in Rhode Island. Right there on the end, it's close to Newport, which is where the majority of his time was spent at that time. So he does receive orders after a few years there in Rhode Island down to the west, southwest. He does get stationed in San Antonio, in New Mexico, a lot of different areas down there. And he does basically do protect post office trains, things like that, transportation for those things. He's providing a security for them. And one time he's in the area of Las Vegas, and a messenger had been attacked. They come back to the garrison. They tell the local commanding officer, hey, I got attacked about 10 miles east of here. And so he goes to investigate with a small group, and he gets his first action. His first action as a military member is in a small skirmish with some Apache Indians, and he does get shot in the neck with an arrow at that time. Pretty gruesome to think about that, but that is where he receives his first action as a military member. Later on, he gets sent back down to San Antonio, and he gets assigned to work at copper mines in New Mexico. So at that time, the government and civilians were working together. They're contracting together to mine this copper from this mine in Santa Rita El Burrito in New Mexico. Huge deposits of copper, and they're supposed to be working jointly. There is, however, quite a lot of friction between the civilian department there and the military department there. And so while he's there, the commissioner of the mining company there, the civilian, wants to get the military not involved anymore. The military commander there doesn't want the civilians involved anymore, and they both decide to send a request to Washington, D.C. to get the other person removed from mining operations. And so Ambrose gets ordered himself personally to deliver a message to Washington, D.C. from New Mexico. That is over 1,200 miles, primarily through Indian country, again, at that time. And so the civilian messenger did take the route south, so they went through El Paso, down through San Antonio, and then up and through the more developed states there at that time. Ambrose, however, takes a shorter, more direct route up and through Missouri, up through Kentucky, and he does have some experiences that make him think, oh, by the way, this is that Santa Rita. That's a copper mine there, big, deep copper mine at the base of the hills. That's a copper mine at the base of the hills there, and this is where a lot of the locals were living. He does get sent off to Washington, D.C., and he experiences something that starts him thinking on the development of his firearm in particular. So as they're doing a river crossing during this journey, one of his aides falls into the river with his flintlock rifle, or flintlock musket at that time. They get out, they're able to salvage everything, but the next day when they wake up, that lock is so rusted that it renders the weapon inoperable. And that's where he really starts to think that there has to be a better way for weapons to be loaded, for them to lock, for them to not allow excess dirt, liquid, things into the mechanisms of the rifle itself. And there was a lot of problems with expelled gas as well at that time. And so on his way to Washington, D.C., he starts thinking about these things. He arrives, he delivers his message. Unfortunately, he does arrive earlier than the civilian messenger, but the argument was invalid nonetheless, and so the military does get removed from those mining operations and gets a new commander instilled. But he does, at that time, while he's in Washington, D.C., present his drawings and his ideas to the Secretary of War at that time, John B. Floyd. And people were very impressed with his ideas. This very simplistic design, breech loading. It does close completely, doesn't allow the expels of gas, doesn't allow anything in. Very unique for that time. And it also comes with its own, he also has a cartridge patented as well. This cartridge here was a completely unique thing for that rifle as well. So he designs this, and he does make some temporary, preliminary prototypes at the Springfield Armory. That's where he does some of his first testing and designing. He's able to manufacture a few and test them as well. This is his actual patent for the improvement in metallic cartridges for the breech loading firearms. So he has a patent on both the rifle itself, but also the cartridge here that you see here. It's a brass cartridge with the grains inside, and then the ball here. After he designs this and creates some prototypes in Washington, D.C. at the Springfield Armory, he decides now is a good time to resign his commission, leave the military in 1852, just 5 years after graduation, and start making and producing this rifle, because he does believe it's going to be so successful that he will be able to make a living off of it. And so he takes his rifle that he invented, and he goes to West Point, because there's a competitive test of arms. At that time, the U.S. Army had a $900,000 surplus in which they were supposed to purchase rifles, and they were testing them to see which one they wanted to purchase, which contract they were going to take. And so the competitive test involved 20 rounds at 100 yards, 20 rounds at 600 yards, 3 rounds at a pine board target so that they could see what the penetration of the round was as well, 18 rounds for rapidity, and then 100 rounds at 100 yards with no cleaning, so that they could see what rapid fire and continued fire would do to the mechanisms of the rifle, if there was going to be overheating, if the stock was going to come loose from the barrel itself, things like that. It was a very strenuous test. Of the 18 inventors that were invited, I believe only 16 showed up. So Ambrose shows up, and he's only allowed to shoot the first 6 rounds. From the first 6 rounds of the 100 yards, from that point forward, the testers, the members of the board at West Point, are supposed to be using the rifle. That way they're an unfamiliar individual with the weapon, and they can truly see what a greenhorn, someone that hasn't used it before, would be capable of doing. Just so happens that a member of the board at that time is his old roommate, Harry Heth. I don't know how much coordination they had before that, but Harry Heth is the one that does test his rifle of the board. Quite a lot of testing, if you see, especially the 100 rounds at 100 yards. The 600 yards, that's pretty impressive. Probably didn't hit too many targets. The pine board target as well, the penetration round. Very, very strenuous test. At the end of this test, the Burnside carbine does come out the clear and present victor. It excels in all of these things, and at the end of the day, after those hundreds of rounds have been put through it, it still looks the same as before, still functions the same as before. Very simplistic design, yet very efficient as well. Rifle specifications that we have here, 6.6 pounds, 23 and 3/4 inch barrel, the fairly large bore at that time. And then, like I said, inside the brass shell, there's 50 grains of powder, and then the weighted ball within. So, pretty impressive rifle, definitely, especially after all those rounds of testing, and he comes up on top. So one would think that he would receive a contract to make that rifle and produce 900, maybe not all the $900,000 worth of rifles, but a good chunk. That, however, was not the case. Secretary of War John B. Floyd, like I said, does contract Bristol Rifle Works for a very large order of rifles. However, he does then renege, causing the eventual financial demise of Ambrose Burnside. So he goes into it. He knows this is a better rifle. He offers Burnside the contract. Burnside makes this, creates these factories that can make the rifle completely through. It's this huge factory system that he sets up in Bristol, Rhode Island. He is then unable to follow through on any of these orders, because Secretary Floyd then gives that contract to someone else. There's rumors that the other person paid him a hefty sum of $100,000, a bribe, so that he could then receive that contract. So Ambrose built up this factory of his own personal money, intending and believing that he was going to receive this contract, and then he has that contract taken away from him, and he is unable to pay back his debtors, and we'll see that here in a bit. Floyd, the Secretary of War John B. Floyd, he was involved in a lot of scandals, so this wasn't exactly new for him to go back on a contract like this. He was involved in the abstracted Indian bonds case. He did have multiple cases of improper drafting with government contractors, where they would draft large amounts from the Department of the Army, and probably a little bit more than they were actually required. And there wasn't any proof that he necessarily profited off of them, but the case was thrown out due to lack of evidence. And then probably the most, in my opinion, one of the worst ones of all, prior to his nomination as Secretary of War, he was very pro-abolitionist. He did not believe in the secession, anything like that. However, during his tenure, especially after he gets in trouble with Buchanan for these two things, he starts to maybe change his mind a little bit, maybe show his true colors. From that point forward is when he starts shipping arms to the southern states before the war commences. There was no need for him to route the weapons the way that he routed them through the South whenever they were being delivered and they were getting stockpiled in these southern states just prior to the war kicking off. So, pretty interesting story. While I was doing research on Burnside, I ran across this and I actually went down a long rabbit hole on Secretary Floyd instead. But very interesting character, someone with clearly questionable morals. He does renege on the Bristol Rifle Works contract, and it is the demise of Burnside here. This is John Floyd here, another famous Confederate general. After the war, he does join the Confederate side. So, like I said, he does experience financial ruin because of that reneged contract. He has all of this money invested in this giant factory and no contract, nothing to make, and so he does have to sell off his patents for both the rifle and the cartridge. This is a big deal because later on, the rifle does become the third most used carbine in the war. The Spencer and the Sharps carbine were the two most popular carbines during the Civil War. Very close third, the Burnside carbine. A lot of people don't know that, and he doesn't receive any money from that. Over $55,000 were used during the war. He probably would have received a pretty hefty sum for that if he hadn't have had to sell his patents for that. Bristol Rifle Works does stay in operation after he sells it, and they do eventually start making the Sharps rifle or the Sharps carbine after the war commences. So once he does sell these patents, he is completely disassociated with the carbine or the Burnside carbine, other than by name, and that name is pretty important in his military career. He is a likable guy. He is pretty effectual in some cases, especially in East Tennessee and North Carolina. However, obviously, once he does receive the command of the Army of the Potomac, he has some pretty serious failures, but he does get by a lot on his personality and the success of his firearm as well. He does go back towards his home state of Indiana to start looking for jobs at that time, and he ends up working at the Illinois Central Railroad. And just so happens, at that time, the vice president was George McClellan, a former friend, someone that reaches out to him, gives him this job. Burnside was a treasurer there for quite some time. They develop a very close personal working relationship, become pretty good friends as well. And then the war does break out. So what I have here is the telegram that actually gives the orders for him to take over command of the Army of the Potomac. This is the third one that he's received. He does receive throughout the war, and we're not here to talk about some of his failures. Like I said, again, we'll talk just this. I thought this was interesting. He does receive two other previous invitations to take over as commander of the Army of the Potomac. He does decline both times because he doesn't have a lot of self-confidence in his capabilities as a commander of an army of that size, but also his close personal friend McClellan is the current acting commander. He didn't want to do that to him. He thought it might look as a sign of a betrayal. On the third time, he does receive this. He does accept, and a large part of it was because the messenger told him if he didn't accept, that he was going next to General Hooker, who Ambrose Burnside wasn't too fond of. So he accepts this, and then immediately thereafter has some pretty successive failures with Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, definitely the Battle of the Crater. Throughout the tail end of the war where he has these failures, he does try and resign his commission, again, multiple times. And every time he's declined by President Lincoln. President Lincoln states that I know you weren't successful with these larger battles. However, I do believe that maybe sometime in the future there may be something that I can use you for, something that you're useful for. And so I will not let you resign your commission. So he doesn't actually lead troops anymore after the Battle of the Crater. He does return home to Rhode Island, and that's when the war does end while he's in Rhode Island. However, before the war's over is when he's already starting to think about his post-war career, and we will see some of that next. Immediately after the war ends, he starts campaigning for governor of Rhode Island. He does campaign as a Republican this time. Prior to the war in 1857, he is nominated as a Democratic candidate for the House of Representatives for Rhode Island while he's working at the Bristol Rifle Works and really getting that off the ground. He was nominated. He had no interest in it really, but he goes along with it, and he doesn't receive the after he receives the nomination, he doesn't receive the successful election, and so he switches from Democratic to Republican after the war. He is successful this time. He's elected to 3 one-year terms, and a lot of the public really did like him. Like I said, he was a very affable guy. He had already been the leader of the Rhode Island militia during the Civil War. He's very well thought of in Rhode Island. However, he decided that he wanted to change and pursue some different things, and we'll see that in a bit. So he does decline the nomination to continue as governor of Rhode Island, and he does the time he's there. He does spend his time being a effectual governor, but he does spend time with a lot of other ventures. This is the city of Providence, the city hall here. One of the things that he is known for is creating and commissioning this Soldiers and Sailors monument here in the town square, and it's still there today in Providence. Very, very beautiful. After the war, he does these other ventures that he's working on, very, very heavily involved in the railroads. Railroad companies in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Also the Narragansett Steamship Company. I thought that was interesting as well. But during his time as governor, he is working on the board of a lot of these companies. He's president, vice president of a lot of these companies, and he's able to use his position within these companies to help out old friends. He does find himself back into financial stability after his ruin prior to the war. One person in particular that comes to mind is Harry Heth. Harry Heth does find himself, conversely, in ruin after the war. He writes into Ambrose. He says that he's having a rough go of it. Ambrose says, well, I know your family was very heavily involved in coal. Harry Heth's grandfather actually started coal mining in Virginia, and so Harry said that if he could get some funds from Ambrose, that maybe they could work together as joint partners. And so Ambrose has a lot of faith in his old roommate. He's a very, very close friend, like I said, and despite the last four years of war, he gives him basically a blank check. He gives him an open draft. He says, draft what you need to. I'll be your partner in your coal venture there in Virginia. All you have to do is find the land. Just keep me up to date on what you have going on. Very, very well-liked guy because of generous things that he does like this. So I got some tickets here to show you. Some railroad tickets of the Cairo and Vincennes Railroad that he also is a part of, and the Rhode Island Locomotive Works in Providence as well. Other interesting happenings after the war. During the Franco-Prussian War, Ambrose finds himself in London at that time. He's working on selling some bonds for the I believe the Cairo and Vincennes Railroad. He's over in London trying to negotiate the sale of these bonds for this railroad company. And while that's happening, the Franco-Prussian War is going on just across the channel. And so what he does is he and General Duff decide to go check it out. They're both military minds. They want to go see this. And so they do hop over to France, and they heard that the German advance was in Versailles. And so here are two American generals. This is a really funny story. Just walking in looks kind of like a pheasant hunt, I think, the way it was described. They're walking in boots, pants, and flannel jackets through the French countryside, trying to find the forefront of the German advance. They are eventually taken into custody by the Saxon 12th Regiment, I believe, because here's two random guys walking around that don't speak any German. Considered pretty suspect right behind enemy lines at that time. They do get taken into custody. They end up meeting with Otto von Bismarck, and they're able to clear their name. There were other American generals working over there. And it all comes a knot, but it is pretty funny that they were taken into custody in Germany while he's supposed to be in London conducting railroad business. And again, he meets Otto von Bismarck, and here is another example of his affability and just how gregarious he is. He ends up becoming pretty good friends with Otto von Bismarck over the course of a couple of weeks. They spend a lot of time together discussing military tactics, things like that. And Otto needs someone to go over to Paris, which is where the French resistance was just holding out. And he decides that he's going to send Ambrose Burnside, of all people. So he conducts a very impromptu peace mediation talk there for the French and the Prussians. It doesn't come to fruition, but he does go into Paris waving a white flag, quite literally, trying to conduct talks with the leader of the French resistance at that time. Very, very interesting kind of guy. Isn't successful, like I said, and he returns to the U.S., but he does get a taste in foreign affairs, and we'll see that later on, how that plays out. Otto here. Immediately after that, he does return to Rhode Island, and he gets involved in other things. I'll leave it on this slide. Other interesting happenings. He is elected the Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic as well. That's a position that he holds for quite a while. And then also, I didn't know this, at the inception of the National Rifle Association, he is also elected president, which goes to show you how heavily involved he is in rifles and firearms, even though he's remembered for being not a very good general and having sideburns. He was actually very heavily involved in firearms and rifles at that time. Like I said, the first president of the National Rifle Association. So those were some of the things that took up his time in between governor and becoming the senator. He's elected by the state senate to federal senate, again, as a Republican, which is interesting. But he serves for 2 terms. He does pass away September 13th, 1881 due to angina, heart and chest pains that he has. And while he's on the Senate, he's a chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Like I said, he got a taste of that when he was working with Otto von Bismarck for a couple of weeks there during the Franco-Prussian War. Also, as you can imagine, very, very heavily involved in the Military Affairs Committee as well. This is him in 1880. So again, you still see same exact hairstyle. Looks very similar to that one right after he graduates West Point, just a little bit different color there. Much more stately. He holds that for the rest of his life. Very well liked guy, despite some of his shortcomings on the battlefield and really his decision making. But outside of that, tall, good looking, smart, funny, great horseman. I mean, really the characteristics that a lot of people look to in battle, just maybe not the best decision-making skills sometimes. We're going to talk now, at the very end, about his bewhiskered legacy. So if you Google sideburns, the definition that comes up is a strip of hair grown by a man down each side of the face in front of his ears. Originally, the origin was Burnside, but in the early 19th century, late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, the syllables do get flipped for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, but it goes from Burnsides to sideburns. You can see that peaking here. Usage over time, and it's attributed to the name of General Burnside, who affected this style. So I'm going to flip through some very famous people with famous sideburns maybe, and you can guess their names. I think there's some pretty obvious ones here. Obviously, we've got John Travolta here as Danny Zuko in Grease, and you see those there. Another famous actor here, Nicholson, with some coming down here. We've got Will Ferrell in one of his more recent roles with some there. I believe he's supposed to be a NASCAR driver in this one. We've got Mr. T. I don't know if these count as sideburns or if he's just got a mohawk and then I don't know how this works really, but I thought those were pretty powerful ones there. Here's one that looks very similar to what Ambrose had throughout his life. We've got Bill Murray here with the up and over and nothing on the bottom. And some of the most famous ones here, we've got Elvis. And I always think this is interesting. So Elvis does get drafted into the Army in 1960. And these famous sideburns that were known for a time of war by a general, as soon as Elvis joins the military, they're all gone. Things have changed quite a bit. No longer are we seeing generals walking around with beards down to here, tucked in. They don't do the little three-finger Napoleon pose either. But what I wanted to talk to you today about was Ambrose. Some of the things that made him who he was, the person that grew up without a mother, attending West Point, and maybe having some dalliances here and there into mischievous activity. But he's a generally likable guy overall, very inventive, very smart guy who is able to create a firearm that's so prolific. It's the third most used carbine during the Civil War. Unfortunately, he is remembered primarily for his failures, but here we've got some other indications of his legacy that lives on after him. So that is the end of my talk. This is the end of the Burnside conversation, and I'm going to open up the floor to questions now. And maybe we have someone on lights.
Did he ever marry and have a family?
That's interesting as well. He gets left on the altar once. During his time, his first military stint, 1847 to 1852, he does get leave to go home. He goes home to Indiana, meets a girl from across the border in Kentucky, falls in love with her. They go to get married, and on the altar, she decides that she no longer wants to marry him. She becomes pretty famous later on, Charlotte Moon, and she is a Confederate spy actually during the Civil War. And he just so happens to be in charge of the Ohio district at that time. So when she's caught as a Confederate spy trying to smuggle munitions and missives to the South. He is the commanding general of that region, and here he has this reunion with this woman that left him on the altar. He decides that her punishment should be being sent to the South, if that's what she likes so much. She gets sent to the South. Her husband, who was an Ohio lawyer at that time, has to jump through quite a few hoops to try and get her back. Pretty interesting, but he does eventually marry a woman from Rhode Island. Name's slipping my mind right now. But he does eventually get married. They do not have children, and she does pass away just about 5 years before him.
What was his rank in the West Point?
It goes up and down. So those demerits. He gets lieutenant. He does get captain because someone else was removed of the captain rank. He goes up for captain only for a couple of months before he is knocked back down to lieutenant.
Where did he rank in the number of?
Of his class. It said 18 of 53 because he started with 53, but the graduating class was actually only 30. So I think that's an inflation of his numbers. He was 18 of 30, not 18 of 53.
Who eventually bought his rifle company?
I think the bank had he kind of foreclosed on, so the bank owned the factories itself. I don't know exactly who bought his patents. But they do continue to produce it until like the 1863 year when they switch over to the Spencer carbine.
And did they start the rifling through when he was?
I don't think, no, he did not have rifling in his, no ma'am.
Do you have any idea why his rifle came in third? What were the advantages
Of the other two, I'm not sure. I know his was primarily used for cavalry, so maybe that's why it wasn't as popular with the infantry. It was considered shorter, and you could swing it over and behind your horse's head a lot easier than you could one of those longer rifles.
No, I thought it was third for cavalry. It's third overall.
Yeah, no, third overall, yes, sir.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't the cartridge more expensive to produce?
Significantly.
Whereas the other carbines had paper cartridges?
They had paper cartridges. He had a brass cartridge that they filled with powder. And that was kind of the biggest complaint. If something did malfunction with his rifle, it was typically the cartridge that didn't necessarily eject as easily as they wanted it to.